Working in 3 dimensions in After Effects can be quite straightforward, or it can be quite tricky depending on the type of work you do. In this tutorial, we'll start with the basics of 3D. In order to start working in 3D in After Effects, you first need to create a standard composition, so I'll do that by pressing Command N, and I'll just go and call this 3D, and then I'll leave the rest of the settings as they are, and press OK. And now that we have this composition, we can start creating layers and turning them into 3D. Let's start by creating a solid by pressing Command Y, and I'll make sure that the solid is the same size as the comp by clicking on this button, and then I'll press OK. Now that we have this solid, we can have a look at how to turn it into a 3D layer. Before I do that, let me open up the transform controls of this layer by clicking on this arrow, and then I'll make a bit more space here so we can see what's going on. I'll click on this again. Right now, you see most of these properties will have 2 values. So anchor point, for example, has X and Y, position has X and Y, scale has X and Y, and so on. As soon as you turn the layer into a 3D layer, you'll have 3 values instead of 2. So this is horizontal and vertical. And as soon as you make the layer 3D, you'll have the depth as well. And turning a layer into a 3D layer is actually quite straightforward. All you have to do is to come and click on this button here under the cube. If I click on this now, the layer has just now become a 3D layer. I know that because of the cube here, as well as looking at these values now, I have X, Y, and Z. So we have the horizontal axis, vertical axis, and the axis that goes back and forth, the depth. As well as having the third axis now, the Z axis, you'll notice that we have a couple of new things. We have orientation, we have geometry options, and material options. I'll leave the geometry and material options alone for now. We'll concentrate on the transform settings. You'll also notice that we no longer have a single rotation value. Let me just go and make this a 2D layer again by clicking on this cube to turn this off. Now if you look at this, the initial value was just rotation. If I make this 3D, you see instead of having rotation, we have X rotation, Y rotation, and Z rotation. Now these are all indicators that the layer is now in fact a 3D layer. What do these mean though? So let's have a look at them one by one. Now anchor point, if you remember, as you start dragging this left and right, would start shifting the contents of the layer left and right. That's something we know, so that's nothing new. And Y would do the same going up and down. But this time, Z is going to start pushing the layer backwards and forwards, or rather, the contents of the layer backwards and forwards. So now if I push the Z towards right, the layer's contents are getting closer to us, and if I push it towards left, they're getting away from us. The contents of the layer aren't scaling down, they're just going away from us. Alright, so there's 2 different things. Scaling and being away from the camera are 2 different things. If this is happening a little bit too slow, you'll remember that you can press Shift and then drag this right or left. You see it's going much faster now. I'm just going to click on this button to reset so we can start again. And we can do the same for position. So that's X, that's Y, and that's Z. I'm going to reset this again. And we'll also have the same for the scale. But what about these orientation and rotation values? Now let's start with the rotation values first. Instead of having just 1 rotation, we have 3 rotation values, X, Y, and Z. If you imagine your layer being a piece of paper, and then you have a string that goes from left to right like this along the x-axis, and if you rotate the piece of paper around that piece of string here, that would be an x rotation. So if I now go and rotate it on the x, this is what the x rotation does. So it kind of tilts the layer away from us or towards us. Let me reset. And if you take that imaginary piece of string and make it go from top to bottom, and then rotate the layer around that piece of string, that would be your Y rotation. So this would be tilting the layer sideways like this. Let me reset again. And the last rotation, the Z rotation, is that piece of string again this time goes through the layer right in the center. And if you now start spinning the layer sideways, you'll see that's what the Z rotation does. This in fact is very similar to the normal rotation before you made the layer 3D. So a normal rotation is in fact a Z rotation. Let me undo that as well. And the final property I'll show you here is orientation. Orientation does something very similar to rotation, but not quite the same. Let me show you what I mean. If I click on the X orientation, I can just drag this and you see that the layer starts rotating. I can do the same for the Y orientation. You may be saying, well, why do we have 2 then, the rotation and orientation? Because orientation is usually used not to animate things, but to set their initial poses. What I mean by that is this. Let's say, for example, you want the layer to start like this and then animate around its Z-axis. I'll go to Z rotation now and just animate this. You see that the layer is rotating around its Z-axis, but all the while it's facing away from us in that direction. And the Z rotation here is what you'd be keyframing and not the orientation. Let me show you what happens if you keyframe the orientation. Let me reset everything again. Let's say, for example, we keyframe the X rotation, and then we go forward to 1 second, and then we change this to, let's say, 350. Somewhere around 350 like that. And if I go back and play, of course, we'll now see this rotating by 350 degrees. But if I do the same for orientation, something very different is going to happen. Let me just disable these keyframes and then reset these, then go back. If I keyframe orientation and then go to 1 second, if I then set this to 350, and if I play it, here's what's going to happen. The layer is following the shortest possible path to go from 0 to 350. In this case, it's actually going backwards. So it goes from 0 to 359, then 358, and so on, eventually down to 350. So in short, you don't keyframe the orientation usually. You keyframe the X, Y, Z rotations. Orientation is only there to set the initial pose of the layer, so you can then go and keyframe the rotation values. I'm going to disable this and then reset this. And in the next tutorial, we'll talk about how to move and rotate the layers by using the selection and the rotation tools.